Good evening, good morning, our colleagues, alumni, guests, and friends. My name is Amy Chang from Notre Dame Beijing, and it is my honor to welcome all of you today for Thomas Aquinas on Mind and Action online discussion led by Professor Therese Cory, Professor Lingchang Gui, and commentator Dr. Yu Chiu. This event is co-organized by Maritain Center, Huazhong University, and Notre Dame Beijing. We're gathered here to engage with groundbreaking ideas. Now, I'm excited to introduce Notre Dame Beijing's Executive Director, Ms. Jingyu Wang, for welcoming and opening remarks.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to this online discussion, Thomas Aquinas on Mind and Action. It's a pleasure to see so many of you joining us today, both virtually in South Bend and from China. This event marks an exciting continuation of the collaborative efforts between Notre Dame and our partners in China. Specifically, this discussion is co-organized by the Notre Dame Maritain Center, Notre Dame Beijing, and Huazhong University of Science and Technology in China. Looking back, this event builds upon a rich history of engagement in medieval philosophy between Notre Dame and China, launched by Maritain Center and Notre Dame Beijing. Many of you may recall the successful Phase 1 of this initiative in 2021, which featured 3 virtual lectures, and the Phase 2, the virtual colloquium on Thomas Aquinas and natural law in 2022. These events laid a strong foundation for the ongoing dialogue and exchange of ideas. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of Notre Dame Global in fostering this partnership. Their Asia Guest Scholars Artist Partnership Program played a crucial role in facilitating the visit of Professor Gui Lingchang to our Notre Dame campus after the pandemic. This visit provided a valuable opportunity for Professor Gui to meet in person in South Bend with Professor Therese Cory, further strengthening the ties between our institutions. As we gathering today for this discussion on Aquinas, we are not only reflecting on the rich research tradition of medieval philosophy, but also looking ahead to the future of our collaboration. We extend our sincere gratitude to Huazhong University of Science and Technology for their continued partnership in making this further collaboration possible. We are particularly enthusiastic about the prospect of welcoming more Notre Dame faculty and China scholars to a conference in China in the upcoming years. This will represent Phase 4 of the Notre Dame Medieval Philosophy and China project, and we anticipate it being another significant milestone in our ongoing engagement. Finally, I would like to express our sincere thanks to the invaluable staff support from Amy at Notre Dame Beijing and from Chris and other staff from Maritain Center in organizing this event. We anticipate a fruitful and insightful discussion today, and we look forward to exploring the perspective on future research partnership and collaborations that will emerge from our time together. Thank you once again for joining us. And before we begin our discussion on the Thomas Aquinas on Mind and Action, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we will let's welcome our Professor Therese Cory. Dr. Therese Cory is the director of Notre Dame Maritain Center and the associate professor of Thomas Thomistic studies. Her research work is on medieval theories of mind, cognition, and personhood, with special focus on the thought of Thomas Aquinas and his 13th century interlocutors. We also welcome Dr. Gui Lingchang. Dr. Gui Lingchang is an associate professor at the School of Philosophy, Huazhong University of Science and Technology, China. His research focuses primarily on medieval philosophy, particularly on philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, including his ontology, epistemology, ethics, and theology. Currently, Professor Gui is leading a national project titled A Study on the Historical Value and the Contemporary Relevance of Aquinas' Thought on Action. We also welcome our commentator, Dr. Yu Qiu, who is the post fellow at Peking University. Dr. Yu Qiu graduated from Notre Dame Department of Philosophy. Thank you all of the speakers and the commentator. And let's start our online discussion on the Thomas Aquinas on mind and action. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jingyu. Thank you. And also thank you, Professor Cory, Professor Gui, and Dr. Chiu to attend today's discussion. All right, let's dive straight into the agenda and the exciting moment. Professor Cory, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to Jingyu for the collaboration with Notre Dame Beijing, also to my co-panelist, Professor Gui, for the collaboration with Huazhong University, and to the commentator, Yu Chu. It's very nice to see you again, even if only virtually in online space. So thank you to all of you for being here tonight to discuss Thomas Aquinas. It's an exciting moment also for the Maritain Center to be able to celebrate Thomas Aquinas again during his 800th year of his birth anniversary. So thank you for being here. My paper is on the concept of immateriality in Thomas Aquinas. So the title is Thomas Aquinas on What It Means for the Mind to Be Immaterial. And it's certainly the case that philosophically, we reflect a great deal about immaterial entities or non-physical entities. Those of us who work on medieval philosophy spend a great deal of time thinking about immaterial entities, such as God or angels, souls, minds, or persons. In contemporary philosophy, that's a big question of whether mind and its activities are physical or non-physical. But for all of the investigation about the immateriality of mind and how much of a controversial topic that is, there's been surprisingly little discussion among philosophers about what it means to be immaterial in the first place. So this evening, I want to give some thought to the concept of immateriality itself. And in doing so, I would like to step back from the usual question of asking, is X immaterial, or are there any immaterial X's? And subject the question itself to scrutiny. So what I want to ask is, what are our unstated expectations for what it would mean to answer a question like this in the first place? What hidden assumptions about immateriality govern our discussion? So in the first section of the paper, what I would like to do is bring to light the key features of a popular conception of immateriality, which I call the spooky body view, and which has also had considerable philosophical influence. And then in the second section, I will sketch an alternative and hopefully far less spooky conception of immateriality that is represented by the great medieval philosopher and theologian, Thomas Aquinas. All right, so proceeding to the first section of my paper on the spooky body conception of immateriality. In the famous Victorian story written by Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol, describing Ebenezer Scrooge, who on the eve of Christmas is visited by 3 ghosts. So it's a story that's full of ghosts. And we find Charles Dickens describing the ghost of Jacob Marley, the first ghost to visit Scrooge, who is described in a very witty way. So here's what Dickens says. He says, "The same face, the very same, Marley, in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind him. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it before. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him." Now, the ghost of Marley in Dickens behaves with great propriety according to all the established customs for imagining an immaterial substance. For one thing, the laws that govern the interaction of bodies appear to have no purchase on him. He arrives in the flat by passing directly through a locked door. He departs by floating out a window. And yet, Dickens imagines him in all other respects as though he were a body, transparent, of course, but still a body, something extended, moving through the room in time, taking up space, a whole that's composed of ghostly parts, and characterized by the same shapes, textures, and proportions as Marley's living body. So the way that Dickens describes him, he is a kind of non-bodily body, one that is spookily both like and unlike normal bodies. And what Dickens captures here is our ingrained imaginative tendency to imagine immateriality as an anomalous materiality. So we can't help but imagine immaterial entities as though they're material bodies except less substantial, emphasized by their transparency or thinness, and thwarting as much as possible our expectations about how bodies should interact with other bodies. For instance, emphasized by their ability to materialize out of and dematerialize into thin air, or pass through solid structures, or float in the air. Now, these kinds of spooky bodies are not confined to the poetic imagination. They can also be found wandering around in broad daylight in our philosophical discussions. So, for instance, in Consciousness Explained, Daniel Dennett asserts that defenders of a non-physicalist account of mind are forced to attribute to immaterial minds 2 competing characteristics. First, unlike a material thing, an immaterial thing permeates the body, but like a material thing, it is able to interact with the body. And this is the exact same conception of immateriality that we see in Dickens' description of the ghost of Marley. So what these 2 examples illustrate is what I would like to call the spooky body approach to immateriality. And this has the following 3 features. First of all, the notion of immateriality at work is basically a notion of strangely behaving materiality, in which certain features of a material body are altered or disrupted, especially those associated with mass, weight, or impenetrability. Second, the negative characteristic of masslessness becomes reimagined as a positive feature of immaterial being, a kind of airy thinness or transparency or fluidity of form. Third, the spooky body view detaches immateriality from mental activity. So a spooky body does not need to be cognitive, for reasons I will explain later. So now let's suppose we're all assuming the spooky body model of immateriality, and we should ask ourselves, what would it mean on that model to ask, is the mind material or immaterial? Well, notice that on the spooky body model, we start with 2 categories, both of which are filled in, and we have some idea of what beings in each category are like. However, one category is familiar. We have lots of experience of material things, whereas the other one is weird. We've never experienced anything like it. So a prominent historian of medieval philosophy, Bob Pasnow, writes this, quote, "It seems to me we can most effectively capture the notion of an immaterial realm of entities by allowing for a variety of possible ways in which the world might be, such that if there were entities like that, then it would be right to think of the world as carved up into two kinds, the familiar material kind and a distinct weird kind of entity so different from what we're familiar with as to go into a fundamentally different category of being." So when we ask, is the mind material or immaterial within that framework, then the question amounts to asking, which category does the mind inhabit? The familiar one that's associated with empirically accessible bodies, or the weird one, the one that we've never experienced that involves spooky properties? Okay. So to assert that the mind is immaterial within that kind of framework begins to look like an admission of defeat. We haven't been able to explain the mind's materiality, so we have to say that it must belong to some other kind of stuff, though we don't know what that's like. Is there an alternative to this way of thinking about immateriality? So now section 2, turning to Aquinas. Now, I think the spooky body view offers a picture of immateriality that is low on credibility, but luckily other models are available. One alternative is what I want to call the self-manifestation view of immateriality, which is represented by Thomas Aquinas. And this view has a long and illustrious pedigree historically, but has rarely been remarked upon by contemporary scholars of the history of philosophy. So what I'm trying to do here is not just sketch an alternative picture of immateriality, but also try to reconstruct a model that has gone missing from our discussion of the history of philosophy. So in discussing Aquinas' notion of immateriality as self-manifestation, I want to think particularly about what he calls intellect, which is his word for the mental power for seeing into, it's from the Latin intus legere, seeing into the natures of things such as dogness, beauty, and humanity. And for Aquinas, this is the only mental power in the human being that is fully immaterial. Of course, there are many more mental powers, vision or imagination, but I'm not going to talk about them in this paper. And I'm only going to focus on intellect as immaterial. Now, here's what is distinctive about Aquinas' self-manifesting view of immateriality. It begins from the claim that knowing is not a function performed by a mechanism, but rather knowing is a kind of being among the various kinds of being found in the world of creatures. So let me first establish a frame of reference for talking about kinds of being. So the way Aquinas understands change, any change can be analyzed in terms of the subject acquiring a new kind of being. So if I want to say that water becomes hot, for instance, what it will say for Aquinas is that heat, which is a certain kind of being, has been added to the water, actualized in the water. Or if I sit out in the sun too long, my skin becomes burnt, which is to say that redness, a certain kind of being, is added to my skin. So on Aquinas' view, any feature of a subject, including its causal powers, its nature, or any other kind of characteristic, can all be explained in terms of actualities or kinds of being that the subject has. So if a body of water measures 80 degrees Celsius or emits radiation at a certain wavelength, or its molecules are bouncing around at a certain speed, all of these are explicable in terms of its having become hot for Aquinas, which is acquiring the being of heat. All right. Now, we become acquainted with different kinds of being, and we're able to distinguish them from each other because we encounter things that have those kinds of being. So for instance, Aquinas takes his concept of materiality from his experience of bodies that have dimension. So here's what he tells us in his most famous work, the Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 18, article 2. He says, from that which exteriorly appears of a thing, we come to know the essence of a thing. And so the name body is given to signify a certain genus of substances from the fact that they are found to have 3 dimensions. So the idea is something like this. We trip over, bump into extended objects. We wrap our hands around them, we cut them apart, we glue them together, we expend enormous amounts of energy moving them from one place to another, or inventing Zoom so that we don't actually move from one place to another. And it's in this very experience of tripping or grasping or lifting or carrying that we are encountering a certain kind of being. What we encounter is material or bodily being, and with three-dimensionality as its most salient property. Now, Aquinas does not worry that materiality is some weird unknown reality that hides behind the appearance of extension. Rather, extension is the distinctive characteristic of material being. Extended being is material being, and when I stumble over an extended body, I am experiencing materiality. All right. So now let's turn to intellectual being. Aquinas tells us that in addition to a genus of bodily things, there is another genus or order that he calls the genus of intellects, or the genus of intelligibles. And this terminology immediately clues us into the fact that Aquinas is thinking of intellectual being as a kind of reality among other kinds of being, like heat or extension or materiality. So what exactly is intellectual being and when do we experience it? Both questions can be answered with one answer. For Aquinas, our experience of intellectual being is just what intellectual being is. We experience this kind of being whenever we have it, which is to say, whenever it is realized in us. So to put it in Aquinas' terms, the mind understands itself whenever it understands something. Or whoever understands or is illuminated knows that he understands or is illuminated because he knows that the thing is manifest to himself. So Aquinas here is trying to account for a phenomenon that we can call implicit self-awareness. And so the phenomenon goes something like this. So imagine that I'm working at my desk, and from the corner of my eye, I see a giant spider crawling up the wall. And I become paralyzed with horror as I watch the spider crawling up the wall higher and higher. And my attention becomes completely consumed with watching the spider and tracking where it actually ends up going. Now, since my attention is completely consumed by the spider, we might assume that there's no room for any kind of self-awareness in this kind of experience. Nevertheless, if someone comes into the room and says, "What were you looking at just now?" I immediately understand and answer the question. In the first person, I was looking at a spider. My answer does not add anything that was not there already in the original experience of the spider. It merely articulates what was already implicit in that experience. Namely, when I'm experiencing the spider, I'm experiencing it as something that I am cognizing as present to me. So the idea here is that an implicit self-awareness is built into our awareness of other things, so that I am always there, or present to myself as the one who's cognizing, whenever I cognize anything at all, no matter how focused my attention is on the other thing. In short, the intellect experiences itself whenever it's experiencing anything at all. So how does Aquinas explain this phenomenon? For him, the explanation is the essentially self-manifesting character of intellectual being. In other words, intellectual being just is self-experiencing or self-manifesting. And that's why I'm calling this view the self-manifestation view of immateriality. Why does Aquinas think intellectual being has this self-manifesting characteristic? And the answer, I think, lies in Aquinas' view that intellectual being is identical with what he calls intelligible being. Now, this is a famous doctrine of Aquinas. Many readers of Aquinas know that he defends what we call the identity doctrine, the identity of intellect and intelligible, but it's not clear what exactly that means. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of the self-manifesting view to spell out. So I want to spend a little moment on unpacking this idea a little bit more in some technical detail. So what Aquinas, what I want to argue, and this is part of an ongoing project of mine, is I want to argue that Aquinas' identity doctrine is specifically a doctrine that concerns the relationship of intellectual being and intelligible being by positing that intellectual being is identical with intelligible being. They are, in fact, one and the same nature, which can be called intellectual, just as much as it can be called intelligible. So there's, I think, a fundamental misconception in much of the Aquinas literature, which wants to say that the identity doctrine is positing some kind of identity between the intellect and something in the extramental world, treeness in the tree, or waterness in the water. But I think that's not, in fact, what Aquinas is doing. What he is doing instead is he's telling us that for the intellect to be actual is for it to become an intelligible thing. So in other words, intellectual being has a twofold character. The knowing kind of actuality is at once the being known kind of actuality. So intellectuality and intelligibility are just two sides of the same coin, or two dimensions of a single kind of being. So let me give you a quote from Aquinas' commentary on the Metaphysics. He says, Aristotle says that it belongs to the nature of the intellect, that it should understand itself insofar as it takes on or conceives in itself something intelligible. For the intellect becomes intelligible by attaining something intelligible. And therefore, because the intellect becomes intelligible in conceiving something intelligible, it follows that intellect and intelligible are the same. And he explains how the intellect attains the intelligible. The intellect is related to the intelligible as potentiality to actuality, and the perfectible to perfection. And just as the perfectible is receptive of its perfection, so too the intellect is receptive of its intelligible. So that means that we should not think of something's intelligibility in terms of the possibility of becoming the object of an act of knowing. Rather, intelligibility in Aquinas just is intellectual being. Now, we humans have a capacity to receive this kind of being, which is intelligible and intellectual. And this capacity is just what the human intellect is in the first place. And this whole doctrine is laid out neatly in Aquinas' commentary on the sentences in a passage which I'm not going to read in detail here, but I can give the reference in the Q&A. But in this passage, Aquinas describes the intellectual capacity that we have and the actuality that we receive as together forming something one and perfect in the way that form and matter are unified to constitute a single substance. So the point here is that when intellectuality is in its actualized state, it just is intelligibility and vice versa. So let me return to the case of the spider and see how this view accounts for the experience that I was describing. So for Aquinas, when I'm watching the spider and grasping what spiders are, understanding spiderness, that means that a new kind of being, a spidery kind of intelligible being, has taken up residence in me. And this intelligible spider being is just the same as intellectual being. It's the being that something must have in order to perform an intellectual act. So one way of putting this view is that for Aquinas, I know spiders by acquiring a spidery self-manifesting being, becoming spiderified, so to speak. So he says in De Veritate, the knower and known become one thing, actual intellect, which constitutes a single principle of the act which is understanding. And so in short, Aquinas would explain my knowing of spiders and my knowing of myself by a single thing, my acquiring a kind of being which is an episode of spider self-manifestation. This new being can be considered from two aspects: intellect knowing spider, or spiders known by intellect. All right. Now, the implications here are important. One of them is that it shows that the being of thought for Aquinas is something that counts ontologically. So we shouldn't talk about thought for Aquinas as mere thought or something more shadowy or less substantial than other kinds of beings we would think of as real beings. Another important implication here is that the self-manifesting model, the account here, is supposed to explain not only why I become aware of myself whenever I am aware of anything, but why anything is intellectually manifest to me at all. So the idea here is that spiders only become manifest to me if they acquire self-manifesting being in me. Or, we could put this more provocatively, spiderness only becomes manifest to itself as an actuality of my intellectual capacity or someone else's intellectual capacity. So intellectual animals, in short, are the place where the world of matter and motion becomes aware of itself. Okay. Now, the essentials of the view I've been describing can be summarized in two ways. First of all, there is a kind of being that is manifest to itself or self-manifesting, and that is intellectual being. Secondly, I encounter this being whenever I am thinking, insofar as I am self-aware whenever I am thinking. And it's important to note here, I do not stumble upon intellectual being from the outside. Rather, my encounter with it is just my thinking. It's my manifesting to myself in the first person. All right. Now, in the history of philosophy, the proponents of this view are well known for asserting that this kind of being is in fact immaterial. And we will see in a moment why it is immaterial. But first, I want to underscore the straightforwardly experiential approach that has taken us to this point. We began from an ordinary experience of implicit self-awareness. In the act of knowing, we are aware of ourselves as the ones knowing. And this implicit self-awareness is just an experience of a kind of being, self-manifesting or intellectual being. Just as when we trip over a chair, we encounter a kind of extended being or material being. So intellectual being is just another ordinary guy on the roster of the kinds of being that exist in the natural world and that we experience. It is not a specially weird kind of being that's so different from what we're familiar with that we must put it in a fundamentally different category of being. It's just one of the kinds of being that we experience. Okay, now Aquinas makes the further claim that intellectual being is immaterial. So how should we understand what it means to be immaterial from this, now that we have this new perspective? Now, the question already is going to look a little bit different compared to what we saw earlier. So Aquinas uses the term immaterial not to include some pre-established semantic content, some kind of weird or spooky being, but merely with a negative force. It's a kind of being that is not material. So the situation is precisely analogous to the following case. So imagine that you have an entomologist who is studying black widow spiders and asks at the end of his study, are these spider behaviors non-rational? So if he concludes that the behaviors are non-rational, he is not attributing to them some additional properties, the spooky property of non-rationality. He's simply saying that these behaviors, the objects of empirical study, should not be included among what we understand as rational behaviors. Now, to justify the conclusion that spider behaviors are non-rational in this sense, the entomologist would have to show that the spider behavior is inconsistent with what we understand as rational behavior. And similarly, Aquinas thinks, and I'm inclined to agree with him, that self-manifestation can be shown to be inconsistent with extension in 3 dimensions. So here's the argument that Aquinas sets up concerning the inconsistency of self-manifestation and extendedness. And this comes from his commentary on the Liber de Causis, which I was happy to hear just now from Professor Gui that he has a special interest in the Liber de Causis as well. So here's what Aquinas says. No body naturally turns to itself. For since what is turned to something else is conjoined to that what is turned to, obviously all the corporeal parts of a body that is turned to itself will have to be conjoined to all the parts. But this is impossible in things that are made up of parts because of the separation of the parts, with different parts lying in different places. So the evidence that an intelligence is not a body, Aquinas continues, is its return upon its essence, namely that it is turned back upon itself by understanding itself, which befits it because it is not a body or magnitude with one part distant from another, such that one of its extremities would follow the other as distinct from the other with respect to position. End quote. The argument in this text in broad strokes goes something like this. Number one, something is self-manifesting if and only if it appropriates itself whole by whole. Number two, no extended substance can appropriate itself whole by whole. And the reason is that the parts get in the way. One part can contact another part, but the whole cannot completely appropriate the whole. Third, no extended substance, therefore, can be a self-manifesting being. So the underlying claim here, or the way to make sense of this, is that self-manifestation implies the presence of the whole to the whole through and through. Or to put it another way, the whole of a self-manifesting being must be both equally knower and known. If one part were knower and the other part were known, then any knowledge would be the manifestation of the known part to the knower part, and not a genuine self-manifestation. And Aquinas' insight is that since anything extended is divisible into parts, and no two parts, extended parts, can exist in the same place, it's impossible for the whole to be reappropriated by the whole. The extension of its parts gets in the way. Okay. We can think of this maybe in terms of folding a piece of paper. As we repeatedly fold a piece of paper, you get one part to touch another part, but we can't actually get the whole to be folded up to the whole paper all at the same time. That just to stop the screen from going off. I think. Okay. Because maybe you just have to touch the displays. So anyway, there's much more to be said about this argument, but I just wanted to point out the hopefully.
Is it okay if I just touch the
Yeah, I think you could just touch the volume button.
Good.
Yeah. Right. Sorry about that. So Aquinas, it's important to notice that Aquinas is not making a kind of explanatory gap argument. He's not invoking the insufficiency of material causal mechanisms to explain self-manifestation. Instead, what he's saying is that self-manifestation is metaphysically incompatible with spatial extension. And that furthermore, spatial extension and self-manifestation are mutually exclusive and exhaust the possibilities for the kinds of being that exist. So that extension is the obstacle to self-manifestation in material beings. So the conclusion that intellects are immaterial is merely the claim that the kind of being that is manifest to itself through and through cannot be a subcategory of extended being. That's all that it means for Aquinas to say that an intellect is immaterial. And Aquinas underscores this point in a rare moment of fun. This is my favorite text from Aquinas, which I always try to share whenever I can. And it's one of the few cases where Aquinas offers a very quirky thought experiment. And he's usually a very sober person without any jokes or anything in the text. But this is just kind of an odd text. So he says, quote, if a box were to subsist by itself without matter, it would be self-understanding. For freedom from matter implies self-understanding. And hence an immaterial box would be the same as an intelligible box, that is to say, a self-manifesting box. What it means to be an immaterial box would just be to be a self-aware box. There would be no thinking outside the box, nor thinking inside the box, but just box thinking box. Perhaps we could call this a case of self-awareness. All right. So let me conclude then by drawing attention to the three features of Aquinas' self-manifestation approach to immateriality, which differ from the three features of the spooky body approach, which are mentioned earlier. First, the spooky body concept of immateriality began from our experience of material things and hypothesizes the kinds of properties that an immaterial thing might have. And then when we ask in this framework, is X immaterial, we're asking, does X have these spooky hypothesized properties? In contrast, the self-manifestation view starts from an experience of knowing as a real kind of being with properties that we experience in our ordinary life. And in asking, is X immaterial, we are just asking whether these properties are consistent with the essential characteristics of material beings. Second, the spooky body concept of immateriality includes properties that are not part of our experience, whereas the self-manifesting model of immateriality does not attribute to immaterial being any properties that go beyond our own experience of being thinkers, knowers, exercising intellectual activity. Third, the spooky body concept of immateriality could be applicable to things that are not even minds. You could imagine a ghostly dagger, as in the Shakespeare play Macbeth. In contrast, on Aquinas' self-manifestation model, immateriality is conceptualized as essentially mental, essentially intellectual. Whatever is immaterial is manifest to itself all the way down through and through. As a result, the cost of integrating this kind of immateriality into an ontology is relatively low. In order to allow immateriality into the natural world, we do not have to first decide one way or the other whether we're confident that physical mechanisms do or do not have the capacity to explain conscious experience. Nor do we have to posit any spooky properties. Aquinas' self-manifestation model of immateriality simply makes the claim that one of the kinds of realities that we encounter in our trek through life is a non-extended reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cory, for your presentation. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Chiu to offer his reflection, and we will open to our first Q&A session after Dr. Chiu. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop in the chat box. And for our friends over Bilibili, feel free to comment in Bilibili, and I will pass it to Professor Cory. All right, Dr. Chiu, please take the stage.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. First, thank you so much for your great talk. I find this very intriguing, and I'm like so interested in this idea of self-manifesting. Yeah, but I still find that there are some difficult parts in this argument. So first, I think according to my limited knowledge of Aquinas' theory about intellectual cognition, I think the easy part of his theory is this. So we agree that before the human intellect actually knows its object, namely some essence, first, the essence has a potential intelligible being, while the intellect has a potential intellectual being. Oh, by the way, by intellectual being, I mean a kind of active intellectual being, like esse intelligendi. And after the intellect actually recognizes the essence, on the one hand, the essence has an actual intelligible being insofar as, quote, species els denudatur ab omnibus appenditis materia per virtutem intellectus agendis. Right? So this is from Scriptum super sententiis. And on the other hand, the human intellect has an actual intellectual being by being informed by this intelligible species. And I find that you make two different claims, one stronger than the other. So the first claim is that by receiving the intelligible species at its perfection, the human intellect not only has an actual intellectual being, but also an actual intelligible being. So just like Sententia Libri Metaphysicae points out, everyone becomes in actuality insofar as it receives the intelligible unum quodque fit actu in quantum lecipit intelligibile. And this actuality is not only that of agents, operans, and intelligence, but also esse actu in genere intelligibilium, right? So that's a holomorphic union. Intellectus in actu is both actually knowing and actually being known. And the second claim is stronger. Namely, we can move even a step further and claim that the actual intelligible being and the actual intellectual being are identical. So this is not like by the same form, the subject obtains like two kinds of actus essendi. On the contrary, the intelligible form causes in the possible intellect one and the same actuality, which is both intellectual and intelligible. Therefore, we can describe it as a kind of a self-manifesting being. I find this very insightful, but I find there are like three small difficulties. So I put them as like three small questions. The first question is this. So suppose that is a purpose subject of actual intelligible being is the actual intellect rather than any external corporeal substances. So if so, how can we define the scholastic principle that the proper objects of human intellectual cognition are essences of external substances? Because it seems that as such, they can never be actually known by us. Right? This is the first question. The second one is this. Concerning the crucial text of Sententia Libri Metaphysicae, I wonder in what sense the human intellect, by receiving the intelligible species, it is itself actually intelligible. It seems that the text is open to two interpretations. Either the human intellect is intelligible with respect to the known object, as the intelligibilis quantum ad id quod intelligitur, or it is intelligible with respect to the knowing subject, namely itself, as the intelligibilis quantum ad id quod intelligit. Considering the purpose of Aristotle's argument is to show that it belongs to the nature of the intellect that it should understand itself insofar as it takes on or conceives in itself something intelligible. This is a quotation from Aristotle. It seems that the second interpretation is a little bit more plausible. This for sure will bring us back to the so-called standard same order theory of self-consciousness. By the way, this is actually the impression I got from attending your course in Notre Dame, but I no longer trust myself because I did not get an A for the course. The third question is, I'm also a little bit worried about whether there's sufficient textual proof supporting the strong claim that the actual intellectual being just is actual intelligible being. Because most of the cited texts, in my view, only makes a weaker claim that the intellect in actuality is holomorphically one with the actual intelligible. Intellectus in actu et intelligibile in actu sunt unum. This seems to be slightly different from our targeted claim, like if I may say, esse intelligendi est esse intelligibile. Right. So do you think this is sufficient for establishing the claim that establishing the self-manifesting feature of intelligible beings? Yeah, so this is some of my brief comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chu, for these very perceptive and yes, very insightful comments. And I wish we had more time to be able to discuss all of these things. I can only give a very brief comments on with respect to the three questions that you had, but there's a great deal there, and we should talk more about this. So with respect to your first question about what if Aquinas actually thinks that intellectual being is self-manifesting, it should seem to be the case, and you're exactly right about this. It's very puzzling that he doesn't say that therefore intellectual being is what is first known in the intellect, because the intellect's own being is what its experience consists in and is manifest to itself. And I think the reason for that, this is something I was also very puzzled about for a while, and I think the reason is that for Aquinas to be the object of the intellect, he understands it in a very special way. He doesn't understand that just as any old thing that is known, but specifically the cause of our knowledge. So the cause of our knowledge is the essence in the material thing. And this is consistent with his understanding of the term objectum generally in causal context, where the objectum is the cause of a passive power, or also the final cause of an active power. So if we think of the intellect as thereby being constituted as an active power that can perform an action, then that toward which it performs its action is the extramental thing that was its cause. So I think that's how he's understanding the object, is very specifically that to which we are related as cause and end in our thought. That's always the extramental thing. Whether that's a satisfying answer, I'm not so sure, but I think that's how he's thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Regarding the sentences text, yeah. So I'm sorry. Can you just remind me of the second question again?
Yeah, it's about whether Aquinas' commentary on metaphysics shows that, Aquinas talks about like the intellect becomes intelligibilis by receiving this form, right? I just wonder whether this, by saying that it is intelligibilis, it means that it is intelligible with respect to the known object, like as you say,
okay.
like the
Yes.
spiders being known, or is respect to the subject. Yeah.
To itself, yes. So I think actually for Aquinas, both are the case. So intelligible, and this is where the view actually gets a little bit more technical than what I was able to present in the talk, because he's drawing on an older view that goes back to Alexander of Aphrodisias, where Alexander holds that for the intellect to become intelligible to itself, and for the form of a thing, a material form of the thing, to become immaterial as form of the intellect, is one and the same thing. It's just intelligibility. And so it's very puzzling, because then you think, well, in what sense then can we differentiate the thought being a thought of a spider versus my thought, where the mindness versus the spiderness? How are we supposed to differentiate those two elements of the thought? And so I think the way that Aquinas does this is by thinking about it. We start by thinking about intelligible being as sort of an instance of being, and then we ask ourselves, how is it conditioned as this episode of intelligible being? Right? Well, it's conditioned spider-wise, because the ratio of this intelligible being is there's a spider ratio coming from the spiders in their real essences. But it's also conditioned subjectively by my own capacity for this kind of being, such that it is mine. So it is spiderly and it is also mine. So it has this dual dimension, but it's just one intelligibility. So I think that's how he's seeing it. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the third point, I think you're very right that in some of the texts that I cited in the paper, he uses this language of composition that sounds like the intellect is composed with the intelligible, but not really strictly one with the intelligible. And I think this is an artifact of, and maybe this is because of these specific concerns in these texts, but it's an artifact of the presentation in those texts. But maybe some evidence that might hopefully go some way to convincing you that he also thinks that they are in fact just the same and not merely composed, is that he, when he describes the conditions under which something can perform an intellectual operation, he has two ways of describing this. He either says that the intellect must become intelligible, or he says the intellect must become actual. So as intellect, and he alternates between those two descriptions of what has to happen as the sort of basic condition under which something is able to perform an intellectual operation. And then there's other examples like this where he'll talk about the angelic nature. Of course, angel is supposed to be a separate intellect. And so he talks about that nature as being an intellectual nature or an intelligible nature. And he'll say that it's an intelligible nature insofar as it's in intellectual nature. So it seems to me to be the case that he's using these terms to say that there's just one nature there, which is both intellectual and intelligible, not that they're two different natures that enter into composition with each other. And one additional piece of historical evidence to help with that is the fact that actually Albert the Great explicitly makes this point in his De Intellectu. So it seems to be a thought that people are having at the time. And Albert says that we shouldn't think of the intellect and intelligible as composed with each other. In fact, there's just one nature there. So it seems to me that that's actually the view that Aquinas adopts, even though he doesn't state it as explicitly as Albert does. Thank you so much for these questions.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chiu. Actually, we still have a little bit of time. We're opening our Q&A session until 9:30. So if anyone have any questions, feel free to turn on your mic or drop in the chat box. Yes, Kevin?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Therese, for a wonderful talk, which fascinates me. And it's also consistent with something I argued about a year ago, you know, at the Maritain Center about Aristotle's De Anima, and especially the fourth and fifth chapters, in which he has a very non potential understanding of potentiality, you know, and it's almost identical with actuality. So anyhow, almost everything, obviously everything you were saying is consistent in my mind with that. And the one question I have is that, again, we're talking about spooky spirits, or kind of spooky immaterial things. And what would you do? What would you say about syllogisms? And it seems to me that syllogisms, and so in other words, one doubt I have, or at least kind of a concern, is that many of the intelligibles that you're talking about, they're just very single intelligibles, you know. Okay, a spider, you know, and yet when, you know, I mean, an important part of the intellectual activity are syllogisms, and especially practical syllogism. And these are, you know, they have parts. They go through time. You know, and you know, this is very explicit. You know, that you begin with the premises, and then you come up with a conclusion. And so, you know, and they go through time, and time, as you know, is so connected with motion itself. You know, I hate to think that, you know, my own thinking on these things is getting spooky, but
well, yeah, no, I mean, that's I think a real problem for this kind of view, which is sort of designed, if we go back to the Aristotelian commentary tradition and the Neoplatonic tradition, it's really designed fundamentally to talk about simple intelligibles as the sort of basic form of knowing. So it's hard to see what to do with syllogistic reasoning for exactly the reason you suggest. And so that makes it tempting to want to say, well, when we get into the realm of syllogistic reasoning, we should stop thinking in this way in terms of self-manifesting being, and then we should imply some kind of maybe logical or linguistic notion and start thinking in terms of semantics and propositions and things like that.
time and arts, etc.
Yeah, right. Yes. And I think for Aquinas, you can handle this by understanding the syllogisms as being even the parts of a proposition to start with. We just start with the parts of a proposition that human beings are rational animals, to take Aristotle's definition. Each of those are sort of parts made up of instances of intelligible being, which are being organized together by the what we would call a propositional judgment. And so I think he still has the resources to be able to talk about those as being complexes of intelligible being. So intelligible being doesn't just come in simples, it comes in complexes that can be arranged in increasingly more complex ways. And when he's describing the second and third acts of the intellect and forming judgments and then drawing conclusions from arguments, he will often draw an analogy to natural changes, which are kind of surprising to us if we're just thinking about these activities in linguistic terms, in terms of like a mental language or something like that. And what he'll say is, it's sort of the trajectory that the intellect is on is sort of like the growth of a plant or an embryological development, where the intellect is growing through its syllogizing, it's organizing itself, basically, and it's organizing itself in increasingly complex ways until it reaches the fullness of perfection. And so until we sort of know everything that there is to know in the way in which it exists, we're on the path, we're inferior to that point intellectually. And so it's a kind of like vital organic growth that's happening from self-manifesting being. So that's, I think, the way he's thinking about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Therese.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Cory. I think we have one more question, a little bit over time, but it's fine. Can you extend a bit on the subjective dimension of knowing that the known becomes actualized differently in different people from Michael?
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. So when we have, if you think of there being a sort of instance of self-manifesting being that's received into the soul, actualizing a capacity in the soul, I think the reason that Aquinas emphasizes the status of the possible intellect as being like a matter for intelligible being, a subject for intelligible being, is that the receiver of intelligible being conditions that being itself. So it's not as though intelligible being is just sort of this, autonomous bit of reality that's sort of floating around in our soul. It's actually instantiated in our soul. And so in the same way in which any form instantiated in matter is individuated by being instantiated in matter, for Aquinas, this instance of being is instantiated it's individuated by my soul, which is then individuated by the materiality of my body. So that's how when he's explaining, this is really important to him in explaining why Averroes is wrong to say that there's just one intellect for all human beings. So he points specifically to the experience of self-awareness to say that each person understands himself to be the one that's thinking. And these are discrete instances. And the reason for that is precisely because each instance of each intelligible is received into my soul or your soul, and that's what individuates the subject. That's what provides the differentiation between subjectivities. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for Kevin and Michael's question, and thank you very, very much for Professor Cory's presentation. Next, we are honored to welcome Professor Gui to share his presentation. Professor Gui, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you that I can have such an opportunity to present my research. It's basically the research that I have done here. So it's still in its very beginning, I would say. So if there are some mistakes and so on, so just point out, isn't it good? So the topic sounds a little bit complicated, and the topic is the cultural features of action and their moral implications in Aquinas theory. So in this speech, I aim to argue that Aquinas' theory of action contains a specific causal connection between the agent and its effect. This causal connection can be found in the fundamental and by which finis quo and for which finis cuius structure that Aquinas discussed in the context of his theory of happiness. The fundamental function of human intellect and will in action is to construct this causal relationship, thereby introducing the universal concept of a good into particular action. In this process of transmission, there is a certain proportional similarity between the end by which and end for which, since human action is fundamentally distinct from divine action, characteristics by a certain receptive nature, meaning that it can only establish this causal relationship on base of this receptivity. This receptivity, when it aligned with intelligibility, constitutes moral goodness, whereas when the relationship construct deviance from the nature order decided by God for his creation, it lacks intelligibility and produces moral wrongness. So the structure of my speech is as follows. The first part of the speech will explore the causal structure between the agent and the object as is contained within the act. In the second part, I will interpret these cultural structures using Aquinas' distinction between and for which and by which is employed in the discussion of happiness. The third part will demonstrate how the cultural structure within the human acts makes the moral good and evil possible. And then I will give my conclusion. So now the first part, the causal structure between the agent and the object within the end. So let's begin with a well-known proposition from Aquinas' theory of action. Aquinas holds that for an action to be brought from potentiality into actuality, two causal factors are required, whether it's brought into actuality or not, or if it's to be brought into actuality, whether it's directed towards this particular act or that particular act. The former requires the causal factors of the will, while the later requires the causal factor of intellect. The former concerns the execution or performance of the action, while the later pertains to the specific characters. This can be found in many texts, and I just take this text from Prima Secunde of Summa Theologiae, question 9, article 1. And direct after this distinction, Aquinas states follows. The focus of this is on the part of subjects, its parte subjective, which is sometimes acting, sometimes not acting, while the other is on the part of the objects, by reason of which the act is specified. These two causes have two distinct sources. One originates within the subject, that is within the agent, while the other seems to originate externally. So, regarding the subject, that is the agent, Aquinas points out that as being an agent, a human possesses certain nature inclinations and desires. The power of the will operates by taking universal good as its starting point and directing the actualization of particular goods. In some other studies, I have argued that these various particular goods which arise from human nature themselves possess a hierarchical structure. Therefore, if a view on its directing activity fails to follow the proper order, moral wrongness will arise. And which article is at the bottom? That's the article. So, however, let's shift our focus to the part where Aquinas discussed the objects. Regarding the objects, Aquinas states as follows. On the other hand, the objects moves by determining the act after the manner of a formal principle, whereby in natural things actions are specified as hitting by hit. Now, the first formal principle is universal being and truth, which is the object of the intellect. And therefore, by this kind of motion, the intellect moves the view as presenting its objects to it. So in this passage, there are three dimensions that we need to focus on. And these three dimensions also contain and constitute the main issues we will discuss next. First, the objects moves action in the manner of a formal principle, modum principium formalis. What does this mean? And second, how does the intellect, through universal truth, present the object as a desirable good and thereby move action? Third, how is the morality of action related to this? So let's come to the second part, and for which and by which. To understand how the object move action as a formal principle, we need to introduce an important distinction in Aquinas' thought, and for which and by which. In Summa Theologiae, Prima Secunde question 1, article 8, Aquinas Aristotle's twofold distinction of the end found in the physic, metaphysic, and the anima by differentiating between the end for which and end by which. The former refers to the thing itself, which is found the aspect of good, while the later refers to the use or acquisition of the thing. To illustrate this distinction, Aquinas provides two examples. The first is the familiar case of heavy objects and its movements towards its center. The end for which finis cuius is the lower place, while the end by which finis quo is being in the lower place. The second example pertains to practical activity, is that for a money lover or a miser, money itself is the end for which, whereas possessing money is the end by which. Regarding this distinction, I share the same view that Dr. Chiu also has, but I don't know. And it's a very old article for 6 years that they were written. So namely that and for which is given within the and by which, and in this process the and by and in this process the and by which actually holds a certain priority. Thus we can reinterpret the entire process of action as follows. The movements from the universal good to particular goods arise due to the nature of different faculties of the human being. These particular goods must be grabs as good in relating to the universal good, and we can call these particular goods the end by which in potentia or in potentiality. And then immediately following this, the good still requires a formal cause to move it into actuality. In other words, it requires a formal determination referring to a particular thing, which is the end for which. Only through this formal cause can any desired type of good be actualized in act. At this point, we have the end by which in act or in actuality. Thus, we say that the role of the particular thing, the end for which, as a formal principle or formal cause, is to bring the end by which from the state of potentiality into actuality, thereby ultimately becoming an act. This is our answer to the first question. What does Aquinas mean by saying that an object moves action in manner of a formal principle? So, after understanding the basic cultural structure of acting through the concepts of the end by which and end for which, we want to know how does the intellect, through universal truth, present the object as a desirable good and thereby move action. First, we notice that throughout the entire cultural process, the intellect and view of the soul operates from universal principles, the universal good or the universal truth, initiating acts with full understanding. Consequently, first, the principle of human action is entirely internal, and second, this cognition is perfect. To illustrate these 2 points, let's briefly examine Aquinas on account. In Summa Theologia, it's also a famous paragraph, Prima Secundae Question 6, Article 1, Aquinas distinguishes between actions that have principles in and out of themselves. When a storm moves upwards, the principle of this movement is outside from the storm. However, when it moves downwards, this principle is within the storm. Furthermore, Aquinas notes that among the things that moves by the intrinsic principles, some move themselves and some do not. And only those that are moved not only by intrinsic principles, but also by the intrinsic principles towards the end, non solo movertus ut movetur infinem, are perfectly moved by the intrinsic principle. However, Aquinas argues that knowing the end is necessary for being able to, is necessary for being able to move towards the end. Therefore, if a thing has no knowledge of the end, even though it has an intrinsic principle of action and movements, the principle of acting or being moved by the end is nevertheless not in that thing. In other words, all the creatures that do not know their end and goals can also possess intrinsic formal causes, and can those bring themselves from potentiality into actuality. Their movement is not wholly but only partially intrinsic because they are ignorant of their goals. Furthermore, according to Aquinas in Summa Theologia and Prima Secunda, articles later, there are two kinds of knowledge of the ends, one perfect and the other imperfect. This also very famous paragraph. Perfect knowledge of the ends refers to a knowledge that not only apprehends the thing which is the end, but also knows it under the aspects of the end, ratio finis, and the relationship of the means to the end, propositio eius coordinator infinem ad ipsum. That is finem. That is, the knower has complete knowledge of the end such that the ends are completely intrinsic to the knower. However, Aquinas argues that such knowledge of the end belongs only to rational beings, which in the case of creature are human beings and angels. In Professor Cory's research relating to this text and other relevant texts, if it's wrong, just point out, she notes that human acts with these features being completely incorporeally is an act of reflectivity that takes place in a fully and distinctively self-processed way, and is therefore a free action. The reason constructed their judgment freely on this own initiative in a self-aware way. And this is precisely the answer to our second question. The intellect in a fully self-reflective manner begins from universal concepts and freely integrates objects and for which into the order of a good directing action. Likewise, this reflectivity and freedoms are also the source of moral responsibility. And action begins about not only the good, but also the moral good. But the matter is clearly not settled. We not only want to understand the source of the good moral goodness of action, but also the source of the evil or moral wrongness of action. And the later question is evidently much more challenging. To judge this issue, let's compare human action with divine action. Both possess complete reflectivity and complete freedom. Through this comparison, we may be able to identify the origin of moral evil, moral wrongness within the cultural process of and by which this cultural change that and by which in potentia and for which and by which in actum. So let's check the text from Aquinas in Summa Theologia in 105 articles 5. Aquinas says, then does God work in every worker according to these three things. First is an end. For since every operation is for the sake of some good, real or apparent, nothing is good either really or apparently except as far as it participates in a likeness to the superior good, which is God. It follows that God himself is the cause of every operation as his end. Again, it is to be observed that where there is several agents in order, the second will always act in virtue of the first. For the first agent moves the second to act. And those all agents act in virtue of God himself, and therefore he is the cause of action in every agent. Thirdly, we must observe that God not only moves things to operate it, as it were applying to their forms and powers to operation, just as the workman applies the axe to cut, who nevertheless at times does not give the axe its form. But God also give creative agent their forms and preserve them in being. Therefore, he is the cause of action, not only by giving the form which is the principle of action as the generator is said to be the cause of movements in things heavily and light, but also preserving the forms and powers of things, just as the sun said to be the cause of the manifestation of colors, in so much as it gives and preserves the light by which colors are made manifest. So this text shows that God caused creation in three causal dimensions: final cause, efficient cause, and formal cause. In the final cause, all particular goodness is a participation in the highest universal good, i.e., the existence of any good in any creature derives from God as the supreme God, a supreme good. The goodness of any created being originates from God's universal goodness. This means that in the acts of creation, God intentionally and with full knowledge establishes the relationship between the goodness of all created being and the universal good. In the efficient cause, no action of God moves from potentiality to actuality. Therefore, it does not have a temporal process from potentiality to actuality as its role in the efficient cause. God's action is a non-temporal activity, which is the cause and the source of actuality of all creatures' actions. The power of any actors to act to bring potentiality into actuality comes from God. All their actions involve participation in the absolute universal actuality of God. In the formal cause, in the acts of creation, God not only brings creatures into existence, but also directly restores form to them and gives continuality to the reality of all creatures, supporting and sustaining their existence. In other words, God is not only the first cause of all things by bringing them into existence, but also the first cause of all things by giving and maintaining their forms. He's the first formal principle of all creation. So, if we compare human acts with God's creative acts, we find that God's act, as fully self-reflective and free, is self-sufficient. He not only determines the end of his action himself, but also actualizes his action non-temporarily. Moreover, and this is most important for our present discussion, he restores form to creature. Therefore, his acts possess completely reflectivity and perfect freedom. In contrast, on the one hand, the human being is determined by a given nature from which particular goods arise. On the other hand, actions driven by the human will and intellect are temporal. They involve a causal process from potentiality to actuality. And most importantly, the formal elements that moves the particular goods towards action is not come from the human being himself, but from outside. Even in the Beatitude vision, Visio Dei, of the next life, this divided origin between the end for which and the end by which remains. The human being must, on the basis of his own cognition, achieve his object from knowledge as the formal principle of action. So those human reflectivity and freedom are not entirely self-sufficient. They require an external object and for which to provide a formal principle. But what is worse than the beatitudinal vision of the next life is that in this life, the object given to us are contingent. They are introduced only accidentally into a relationship with the ultimate good. As Aquinas puts it, but this or that particular good is posited as the ultimate end of the view, and this principal object like something per accidens. Hence, this given object is not directly operative, unless it's the case in this life. It must be interpreted or assimilated by the intellect into a form that is proper for being desired. The particular good under the cause of this formal principle, now assimilated as a desirable object, is ultimately brought into action. In other words, reason constructed a likeness between the external achieved object and the particular desired good, and the likeness is ultimately manifested in the effect of the actualized good. So I attempt to explain this likeness using Professor Cory's notion of a propositional likeness or mere power likeness. I don't know whether it's right or not. According to Aquinas, I hope so. According to Aquinas, although the sun as a celestial body is not itself hot, heat is a it's a property of 4 elements, it can nevertheless be the cause of heat. It's by virtue of this constructed likeness that the agent and the effect stand in a relation of proportion. And this proportional relation entails that to be an effect it's nothing other than to be the explanation of the agent's form. In the case of action, although the intellect is not itself an object of desire, it's nevertheless able, through intellectual act, to render the desirability to the achieved object, thereby becoming the end towards which the will is directed. It's precisely this interpretive process that enables the operation of desire to be fulfilled. But as we have already emphasized above, since the object is given, the intellect's activity of informing is morally wrong if it's not appropriate within the proportional relationship into which the object is introduced. That is, if this act of formal causation lacks intelligibility, use this word from Father Flannery, then it's moral wrongness. As Aquinas states in Summa Theologiae, Quaesio 18, Articles 2 at 1. He says there, although external things are good in themselves, nevertheless, they have not always a due proportion to this or that action. And so, in as much as they are considered as object of such action, they have not the quality of goodness. So, that's basically my idea, and now come to my conclusion. In this presentation, we analyzed 2 distinct cultural aspects involved in action, one concerning the agent and the other concerning the objects. In the aspect related to the agent, we find that the universal good is brought into a particular good in virtue of view. In the cultural aspect related to the objects, we observe that the object moves the action towards actuality in a specific way. To understand this specific mode, we introduce Aquinas' distinction employed in his discussion of beatitude between the end for which and end by which. We then argue that a particular kind of good can be described as the end by which in potentiality moved by the end for which is finally brought into actuality. If we closely analyze this and for which as the formal principle that moves action into actuality, we will find that it's freely constructed by the intellect on the basis of universal intellectual principles and those possessing moral character. However, since the object is given, the action is good only insofar as the intellect remains in accordance with intelligibility in its ordering of the good with respect to the object. Otherwise, the action is morally wrong. So, building on the results of our analysis so far, we can now take a close look at Dr. Davidson's notion of deviant causal chains. In such case, the mental event does not cause the action in the right way, in his word. For example, the mountaineers does not cut a rope tying him to his partner in order to survive in the life-threatening situation, so that the partner falls and he relieves of the burden survives. Rather, the very thought of doing so horrifies him so much that he accidentally let the knife slip and severs the rope. Davidson's example in Aquinas terms indeed illustrate a case of deficientis virtutis, a deficiency in the agent's capacity. However, whether the action is brought about in the right way does not concern whether the person correctly applies the intellect and will to order the action to the proper end, but rather whether the person employs intellect and will to affect this ordering at all. In other words, it concerns whether the agent follows the causal sequence we have identified in moral action, and by which in potentia, and for which and by which in actum. But a deficiency in the agent's capacity may also mean that the will and the intellect, while acting voluntary and with clear understanding, have ordered the end improperly. In this case, the action likewise takes place, but not in a way that accords with natural reason. It's a failure of agency as well, though not, as in Davidson's example, through the complete absence of rational capacity, but rather through its improper use. As a result, the end for which is misordered within the goods persuaded by the agent, and it's ultimately integrated into the act. This improper ordering also bring about the action, also not in the right way, but in the meaning here different from Davidson's. So maybe we can call the Davidson's version as a material deviation, and that one that we will mention morally is a formal deviation. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gui, and also for your slides. Once again, let's turn to Dr. Chiu to unpack his insight and open to the floor for Q&A session. Dr. Chiu, over to you.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk, and I have learned a lot from it. And I want to say thank you for inviting me to share some of my thoughts and participate in this very great discussion. But I think I'm not quite sure about whether I have followed all your arguments. So I think I have two major questions. The first question is this. It is argued that the role of this particular thing, namely finis cuius, as a formal principle or formal cause, is to bring the end by which finis quo from a state of potentiality into actuality, thereby ultimately becoming an act. By the way, I also have a small point about the translation. Because I prefer to translate this finis quis as and of which, because and for which sounds much like finis qui. And Aquinas explicitly says that God, for example, is not a finis qui, right? So I don't know how to deal with this issue yet, but I prefer to translate it as and of which. I find this expression a little bit hard to follow because in a sense, I agree that finis quis is related to finis quo as its formal cause. Since finis quis is the object of the operation or action, which is finis quo, as Aquinas points out. And as Aquinas points out, each human act obtains its species from its object. Therefore, I agree with you that finis quis is like a formal cause of finis quo. However, I think human practical intellect does not work in such a way that we firstly intend at an like a universal finis quo, and then specifies it by some finis quis. On the contrary, I prefer to think that finis quo and finis quis are like two aspects of the same end. So for example, it is not like we firstly intend at possession in general, and then intend at money possession in particular. The fact is that we desire money by desiring its use. According to the cited Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 9.1, intellect moves the will as a formal cause. And I think you got it right saying that intellect exercises this role by presenting to will its object from which the act of will obtains its species. We will find this the same explanation in Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 1.3. However, noteworthily, it is the act of will rather than the act which is finis quo that is specified. In Summa Theologiae's treatise on happiness, Aquinas makes it very clear that finis quo cannot be an elicited act of will. So this is in Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 3.4. And this is the reason why human happiness, which is our highest finis quo in relation to God, our highest finis quis, is an intellectual rather than volitional act. So this is my first point. And my second point is this. I find that you made a comparison between the primary agent, who is God, and the secondary agents, like human beings, based on Summa Theologiae Prima Paulus 105.5. With respect to formal causality, you point out that God bestows form to creatures, while in the case of man, quote, the formal element that moves the particular good toward action does not come from the human being himself, but from outside. And the purpose of this comparison is to account for the source of evil in human acts. But I think there seems to be a kind of mismatch in the comparison, because like on the one hand, if the emphasis is on the fact that God is the ultimate formal cause of human acts, who not only gives us the forms and virtues by which we act, but also preserves them in us. By the way, this is one of the points Aquinas makes in Summa Theologiae Prima Paulus 105.5. Then the comparison ought to be that while God is the agent whose formal principle of action is not received from someone else, we human beings are agents who act by the formal principles received from others, ultimately from God. So this is one way to establish the comparison. On the other hand, if the emphasis is on the fact that human actions formal principle, namely their objects, are external goods, this I believe is the point that you want to make. Then the comparison should be that while God's act is specified by the divine good, which is God himself, our acts are specified by a hierarchy of goods, in which many are external to ourselves. So to put it in another way, the formal cause in the field of action theory is not entirely identical with the formal cause in the area of Aquinas physics. Yeah, and finally, I have a small point to say about because you have been so nice to quote one of my papers about Aquinas theory of happiness. I want to briefly point out that since then I have slightly changed my idea. I no longer hold the view that finis quo is always prior to finis quos in the order of final causality. Now my understanding is like, if we view the finis quo compound from a perspective of love of concupiscence, amor concupiscentia, then it is true that finis quos, the loved thing, is desired for finis quo, or possession of the thing. However, if our relation with our end is prompted by a love of a friendship, amor amicitiae, then the contrary seems to be the case. Namely, finis quo is possession, is desired for the finis quos, because Aquinas always describe finis quo in a very interesting expression, saying that it is a way by which we're united to our principle. I cannot go too far in this issue, but I hope we have opportunities to talk about this in the future. And thank you again for your excellent talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chiu. So from the, I want to begin with your last remark. What do you mean by if you think that in terms of friendship, then the finis quo, what will be the relation? I think if we talk about friendship, the only importance is only this finis quo, isn't it? I mean, what will be the relationship between finis quos and finis quo in the case of friendship?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. So to start with, in the case of love or friendship, it is not very clear that what exactly is this finis quo corresponding to finis quos, right? Because for a long time, I think that this finis quo distinction only applies to the case of self-regarding love or love of concupiscence. This is the reason why Aquinas in Somatologia, I think is a 2.8 at 3. Aquinas certainly says that, oh, when we talk about like beatific vision and the love of God, all we are talking about a kind of love by which we love God for ourselves. And whether we love ourselves more than God, we will leave them to the later discussion about charity. So right, so there's a problem. But I have a theory that it can be applied to the case of amor amicitiae, and the finis quo in this case is a common life between friends. Okay. And in this case, I think so. I think we can view Aquinas' theory about possession, the end, from two aspects. So on the one hand, we can understand it as a way by which we get this external good and transform it as our own good. So this is based on kind of self-regarding love. On the other hand, we can also understand it as a way by which we are united with the beloved person, beloved, right? Yes. So you get what I mean. So in this second case, what is important is the person, not this operation. And this operation is a way by which we have some relation with the person. But in the first case, the person is not important, or the substance is not important. The important thing is that we possess it.
Yeah,
so,
I agree with you.
So you get what I mean.
You want to say that finis quos in the case of friendship has the final priority, or that's what we indeed want. We want to have a union with another subject as finis quos. We don't like what we are not focused on is this finis quo. That's what you want to say. No, is it?
Not sure.
I mean, finis cuius, the other subject is indeed what we want finally. Or it's our action or our activity, our friendship activity is indeed for the unification with the another people.
Yeah, but my point is that in the self-regarding case, finis quo seems to be more important, right? And in the friendship case, in a way, it seems that the finis quo is more important. So I think this finds Aquinas theory that if we're talking about the love of concupiscence, its object is always some good accident.
Yes, but the
only when we talk about friendship, right? It's different, right?
It's a little bit far away, but only I think the only challenge is that you must answer the question why he used this finis cuius and finis quo when he talked about beatitude or visio Dei. I think there will be a difficulty because I mean we at the beatitudo and the visio Dei we do have a relationship with God and friendship with God. It's not just a concupiscencia relationship.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So traditionally, I think people tend to interpret Aquinas' theory of happiness, especially all these languages of finis quo and finis quo, from a self-regarding aspect, right? So this is the reason why they say that, for example, Shells and like Malloy, they argue that in addition to this happiness, namely visio beatifica, there is a kind of a higher happiness. Like they differ in how to define this higher happiness, but they're not satisfied with this visio beatifica. However, my point is that if we can accept my suggestion that this finis quo language is not limited to the scope of self-regarding love, it can also be applied to other regarding love, then we can like interpret it in a different way, right? We can say, oh, beatification, the importance of beatification is not that it is the highest perfection of human beings. It is indeed. It is value is that it is a kind of conjunctio, right? It's a conjunction, union. Like it has to be united with God. And Aquinas accepts this famous Neoplatonic principle that everything's highest perfection, it consists exactly in its union with its principle, with its starting point, right? We can shift our perspective and try to defend the beatification, like saying that it's a good theory. Yeah, but this is my point. But I'm a little bit, I think what I did not follow in your argument is that I think you want to say that finis quius, this thing, somehow like actualizes or specifies finis quo, right? Because you want to use this way to explain how the intellect as a formal principle, like gradually presents to the will like out of good or something like that. Yeah, but I think you have a very different view about how to understand physical and finis quo from me, right? So yeah, I really want to like understand that argument.
Why you think it's a different view? I mean, well, it's basically the same ideas that finis quius here play a role like a formal principle which can put our our desire or our desire from potentiality to actuality, and this actuality state is what Aquinas tradition, when he talked about finis quius, finis quo, when he talked about that's the finis quo, that the enjoyment or the enjoyment of the status and so on, the enjoyment of the actuality status and so on. So I think
wait.
Yes.
No. The finis, if we say we have a love for some good, which is a substantial good,
Yes.
then this good thing is our finis quos, right?
Yes.
The
Yes.
finis quo, strictly speaking, is not the fruitio, but the possessio, right? Because
Yeah.
fruitio is a volitional act following possessio. Aquinas makes this very clear in like
Okay.
3.4, right?
Yeah, you're right.
So
Yes.
I think I
But-
partly understand the point. So you want to say, I agree that in this sense, finis quos, this thing specifies our will and our desire, right? Because for example, I desire a bottle of wine, and this wine specifies my desire as a desire for wine. Yeah, but
no,
I think
I mean, for example, in the case, you must think about why you are going to drink this wine. You have a certain kind of desire, like, well, you are very unhappy and you want to be happy, something like that.
Yeah, kill myself. Yeah.
And you are thinking about how I can realize that, and you go to the grocery store and look around. Well, okay, this alcohol can make me happy.
Yeah.
So I made a decision that I will buy that. So by using by drinking, that you realize, actualize them. How to say actualize? By drinking, that your desire will be fulfilled. That you are now happy in some sense.
Yeah. I feel we have some disagreement about how to depict the relationship between finis quo and finis quo, because my point is that what is specified by finis quos is our love and desire for this finis quos, rather than finis quo. This is the action which is finis quo. I don't know whether you.
You mean that the finis quos will be specified by finis quo?
No.
What's that?
I think to start with, finis quo is I will make three claims. First, finis quo is the act of possession of finis quos, right? Second, before this act of possession is derived from and based on a love of finis quos, right? Because Aquinas theory is that we have love and the desire and the possession and the rest, right? So this is Aquinas typical action theory. And the third claim is that every act is specified by its object or end, right? So in this case, we want to say both finis quo and the love which gives the rise to finis quo are specified by finis quos. However, my point is, I think what your argument requires is not the claim that finis quo is somehow specified by finis quos, because this does not participate in this practical syllogism. What really matters is that this love is specified by finis quos. So this is, I think this is my first, what I want to point out in my first comment. I don't know whether you agree with this.
No, I don't think that's the idea that I want to say. What I want to say is that you have a certain kind of desire, and an object comes, and the intellect understand this object as something that proper for fulfilling your desire, and now come to the action that you use, or you acting with or acting on this desirable object, and now comes the your action.
I think I find no fault in this depiction, but the problem is what role is played by finis quo in this story.
Yes, that's what I want to argue, that there is an finis quo in potentia in act.
Yeah, this is right. This is difficult part, I think, and also important part of the argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't think that the Finnish code should be understood in this way?
At least I have a slightly different understanding of Finnish code
Okay.
from you.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think I
Okay.
start to get an idea of what you are aiming at.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I agree that we are different in this.
Okay. Yeah. I see. Yeah. Because when I'm reading your article, it feels like that you understand it is slightly different from my interpretation. Yes, I can see this, but I
Yeah. You see, because I always think that they are like two sides of the same coin, right? So
yeah.
I do not think.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but
Yes,
you certainly think that
yes, that's your point. You think the Finnish wheels and Finnish core is the two sides of the same coins, but it's not that one that I'm doing here. Yes.
Yeah, right. You also think that there are some like temporally, at least temporarily
Yes,
distinct.
exactly.
So we can have there's a syllogism participating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's some a little bit different.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, maybe referring to your second question, it's about you think that there's a mismatch when I talk about God's or the divine action and human action. I mean, maybe I'm not sure, but the point that I want to give here is only that. The morally wrongness or morally goodness, but there's not morally wrongness, a divine action, but the morality is in divine action irrelevant to the creatures. I mean, the goodness implied in God's own intellect, own ordering, or the own ratio.
Okay.
Yeah, but our moral wrongness, it really depends on whether we interpret the objects properly in terms of morally properly. And this this is something which different from the divine action. That's maybe so if you talk about the creation and that's I don't know whether there is a mismatch.
Yeah, I think I get your point. Yeah, but then I think that quotation, Summa Theologiae, like Prima Partus 105.5, maybe that is not the best textual support for
maybe.
Yeah,
I can
find finding the model or something. Or like
you're right.
Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas is like why God cannot sin because from a perspective of formal causality, like God's action, subject is always himself, something like that. And I think maybe that will make the argument more convincing.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. But
should we give the floor to other audiences? So yeah, we have talked too much.
Thank you for those wonderful discussion, though. Very enjoy it. So if anyone have any question for Professor Gui, feel free to drop in the chat box or turn on your microphone for questions. It seems like we don't have any more questions. All right. A heartfelt thank you for Professor Cory, Professor Gui, and Dr. Chiu for today's discussion. Let's give our digital applause. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. As we draw this inspiring event to close, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to all of our speakers to sharing their presentation, and also thank you everyone for your active participation. So if you have WeChat, please scan the QR code I will be sharing and join our group chat for sharing your thoughts and having further discussion together and connect with our speakers or colleagues. We will notify all of you in the group chat if we have more online discussion in the future. I will share my screen now. And also, I think guests are asking for the video posting. We will post on our ND Beijing, Notre Dame Beijing Bilibili account. But we will try to edit with the subtitles. But I'm not sure if we will post it on YouTube and other platform. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. So if Professor Cory, Professor Gui, and Dr. Chu and Jingyu want to add something more, we can feel free to add. Otherwise, I think nice event today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.